Hey everyone, we're going to be looking at solving equations using addition and subtraction. So the first thing we want to talk about is the addition property of equality and the subtraction property of equality. And these just state that when you add the same thing to both sides of an equation, they remain equal. And when you subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation, they remain equal. So, for example, we've got 5 plus 2 equals 7 here. Now, I know we always like to think of that equal sign meaning it's an answer, but really it's just telling us that everything on this side of the equal sign is equivalent to or has the same value as everything on this side of the equation. So, the addition property of equality says that if I were to, for example, add 3 to both of these, they would still remain equivalent. And we can see that that's true because 5 plus 2 is 7, 7 plus 3 is 10, and over here 7 plus 3 is 10. So we can add the same thing to both sides of the equation and they remain equal. The subtraction property of equality says we can subtract the same thing from both sides of the equation. So for example, we've got 10 equals 10 here. If we subtracted 2 from each of these, that would leave us with 8 equals 8. So again, we can see subtracting the same thing from both sides of the equation. The two sides are still equal. Now, let's look at an example with the variable. So this first one, a, we have x plus 5 equals negative 1. So we can use these properties of equality to help us solve. So whenever we have an equation like this, and we've got this variable that's unknown, we want to manipulate our equation so that instead of it saying, okay, when I add 5 to x, I get negative 1, we wanted to just say, okay, x is equal to what? Right? And we can do that by using these properties of equality. So I see here, right now, I'm adding 5 to x. And I want to basically undo that. I want to do the inverse operation of adding 5, which is subtracting 5. Right? You can see that if I had this plus 5 and then I subtracted 5, that would leave me with just 0 there. And on the left side of my equation, all I would have is x. But we need to remember our subtraction property of equality. So if I subtract 5 from both sides of the equation, they remain equal. So x plus 5 equals negative 1. I subtract 5 from both sides, and that tells me that x equals negative 6. And I can always and should always check my answer. So if x equals negative 6, let's make sure negative 6 plus 5 equals negative 1. And it does. So we know that we've done this correctly. So let's look at example B. Z plus 3 halves equals 1 half. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own before then resuming to see if you did it correctly. So for this one we have Z plus 3 halves equals 1 half. And again, we want to isolate the variable Z, which means we need to subtract that 3 halves. So if we subtract 3 halves from both sides, that will leave us with z on the left side of our equation. And then 1 half minus 3 halves, right, is the same thing as 1 half plus negative 3 halves, if you want to look at it that way. So we find the difference between 3 and 1 halves, which is 2 halves, and it's negative. So we would get negative 2 halves, and we know that simplifies to negative 1. So z equals negative 1. Again, we could check our answer here. Negative 1 plus 3 halves. Does that equal 1 half? Well, we could rewrite negative 1 as, again, negative 2 halves. Negative 2 halves plus 3 halves equals 1 half. So we're good. Example C says p minus 5 equals negative 2. So again, we want to isolate p here. So to get rid of this minus 5, we need to add 5 to both sides. That leaves us with p on the left side and negative 2 plus 5 on the right side, which is positive 3. Again, checking our answer, 3 minus 5 equals negative 2, and that does indeed equal negative 2, so we're good. 2 more examples here. So example D, W plus 13.2 equals 10.4. Again, we need to get rid of this plus 13.2 here. So we're going to subtract 13.2 from both sides of our equation. That leaves us with w on the left side. And then we have 10.4 minus 13.2. So remember, when we're working with integers of opposite signs here, this would be the same thing as 10.4 plus negative 13.2, which means we can find the difference of these two numbers, and the larger number, in this case 13.2, will give us the sign, so negative. So let's start with our subtraction. 13.2 minus 10.4. 12 minus 4 is 8. 2 minus 0 is 2. And 1 minus 1 is 0. So we get 2.8. Again, negative 13.2 has the larger absolute value, so we know this will be negative 2.8. Finally, our last one, x minus 5/6 equals negative 1/6. So to get rid of this minus 5/6, we need to add 5/6. That will leave us with x on the left side of the equation. Then we have negative 1/6 plus 5/6, which is positive 4/6. And we can simplify that to 2/3.